So I've gotten a lot of questions recently about how I knit my Cozy Memories blanket. As you can see, mine is organized slightly differently so that the decreases or miters end up forming a diamond-shaped pattern rather than all being oriented in the same direction. Now this means that I end up having to pick up stitches as I knit with neighboring squares in order to orient the square in the correct direction. This ends up leading to an extra seam that isn't present in other memory square blankets. Now, early on, it took a little bit of trial and error, and there are a couple seams in this blanket that aren't exactly perfect. But I've finally come up with a technique that I like. Now my seams are nice and smooth. So let's take a look at how I go about doing this. As you can see, I need to add another square to my blanket. I'm going to want the decreases to run from the top left corner, attaching to this beige square here, and run to the bottom right corner, attaching to the green. So how am I going to go about doing that? So to knit my squares, I end up using about 6 grams worth of fingering weight yarn, as well as a pair of circular needles. These are US size 2 or 2.75 millimeter Chiago needles. I like these needles for this project because I think they're pointy enough and lightweight enough and easy to maneuver as the blanket expands and gets bigger. But honestly, any needle that you're comfortable with would work just fine. I've seen people use straight needles and DPNs, all sorts of things. So really, it's all about personal preference. So I'll begin by unwinding a little bit of the yarn and getting myself ready to knit. And again, this square is going to be oriented with the decreases running from the top left corner to the bottom right. In order to do this, I'm going to have to pick up stitches along this beige square and then cast on additional stitches onto my needle in order to get the miter running in the correct direction. All right, I also have a progress keeper here on the front of my work so that I know the right side and the wrong side, as it can get a little bit confusing with such a large knit item. Now here I'm just taking off my stitch marker that I leave on my blanket and setting it off to the side. I'm going to need that in a moment, but I need to have it available to me. Right. I'm going to pick up my blanket here, get it ready to go, and begin by taking that yarn that I've unwound and run it through my fingers to get the right tension. So you can see I knit continental style, which means that the yarn runs through my left hand, and I like to wrap it at an extra time around my pinky for the proper tension. I also do a selvage edge on every square, which means that I slip the first stitch of every single row. I do this because I find it a much easier border for picking up stitches. And then I go ahead and insert my needle underneath both legs of the selvage edge. Again, this is just as if I were to be picking up stitches for a heel flap on a sock. And then I go ahead and wrap the yarn around the needle once and attempt to pull through. The first stitch is always a little bit rough, especially since I only use one needle to do this. You can see that this is a little bit problematic sometimes, but it will work in the end, especially if I get it at the right angle. There we go. I will then pick up the next stitch using both the working yarn and the remnant end of the yarn. That kind of locks it into place a little bit better. And then I will continue picking up the rest of the stitches with just the working yarn. My squares are a total of 46 stitches, so that means I will pick up 23 stitches along this edge and then place the stitch marker at the middle and cast on another 23. Alright, in the interest of time, I'm just going to speed up this part of it. Now that I have all 23 stitches, I'm going to go ahead and count just to be sure. It always is smart to double check your counts. And now I'm going to flip my work over and begin the cable cast on. So everything is in my left hand, my working needle is in my right. And using that working needle, I'm going to insert it behind the first stitch on my left hand needle, right behind both legs, as you can see. And then I'm going to just knit a stitch on. And once that's good, I'm going to knit through, pull it all the way through, and put it back onto the left hand needle. Now, before I do that with this stitch though, I'm going to place my stitch marker so that I know the exact midpoint in my row. So again, stitch back onto the left hand needle and then do the same thing to cast on the next stitch. Again, this ends up leaving a nice row to pick up stitches the next time I want to add on a square. So again, I place the right needle behind both legs of the first stitch on the left hand needle, knit a stitch, and put it back onto the left needle. I'm going to go ahead and speed this up as well, just in the interest of time. Alright, now that I have all 46 stitches cast on, I'm going to go ahead and just knit the first row. First, I'm going to double check my tension, get myself comfortable, and then here we go. Again, you can see that I knit continental style, which means that I end up wrapping the working yarn around the right hand needle using my left index finger. It goes fairly quickly. Right, and all we're doing here is just knitting across. These are garter stitch squares, and since this is the wrong side of the work, there's no decreasing or anything like that that goes on. So again, in the interest of time, I think I'm going to speed up the work here too. Alright, at this point I only have one stitch remaining in my row, and I'm going to slip that over to my right hand needle and tighten it up a little bit so that I have access to the stitches on my left square, right, that green square there, and I can pick up a stitch using my left hand needle. Right. Now remember, I do put that selvage edge on all of my squares so that they're easier to pick up as I knit. And just to point out, the way this ends up working is the decreases are going to be in the middle of the row along where the stitch marker is, and that's going to end up creating a 90-degree turn in the row, right? So that the miter is going to end up running where we want it, right? From the top left to the bottom right in this instance, just like that. However, it does mean that we need to pick up stitches and attach it to the green square there. So I'm going to go ahead and pick up that first stitch on the green square, put it onto my left hand needle, and then replace the slipped stitch from this row onto the left needle as well. And then I'm going to go ahead and knit those two together. So again, showing you that my working yarn is attached to my right hand needle, and then knitting these two together. Again, tightening that up, making sure it's all nice and secure. Turn the work around, and now we're onto the right side of the work as noted by the progress keeper. And then I go ahead and slip this first stitch, the one that was just knit two together, and knit until I have 2 stitches remaining until the stitch marker in the middle of the row. Alright, now I've got those 2 stitches remaining before the stitch marker. And on this side of the stitch marker, I go ahead and knit those 2 stitches together. I'll then slip the stitch marker over to my right hand needle, and then slip, slip, knit on the other side. So now I've just worked 2 single stitch decreases on either side of the stitch marker. And now I'll knit to the end of the row. And I'm just speeding that process up for you, including flipping over to the other side of the work. I always check my tension and everything before I get started, and then again, I want that selvage edge, so I'm going to slip the first stitch. I then knit all the way across to the last stitch of this row. And to show you one more time, I'm going to go ahead and slip this last stitch onto my right hand needle, pick up the last stitch on the green square with my left hand needle, slip the orange stitch back onto the left needle, and knit 2 together. Right. Again, I'm now anchoring this row onto that green square, turning my work around, and now I'm just going to go ahead and slip that stitch back onto my right needle. Right. And now that I'm on the right side, I'm going to knit again until I have 2 stitches until the stitch marker in the center of the row. I'll knit 2 together before the stitch marker, slip the stitch marker, and then slip, slip, knit. blanket all the way to the end of the row. Now this whole process of attaching the working square to the square next to it on the last stitch of the wrong side row and decreasing on either side of the stitch marker on the right side row continues on until the square is finished. Right? Each row will get progressively smaller, and eventually you'll only have one stitch left, and at that point you can just follow normal directions for how to finish. And here you can see the finished square up in the top right hand corner, and you can see that the miter does indeed run in the direction we were hoping for. I hope you found this tutorial helpful, and if you have any questions, please leave a comment below.